It is your host, Adrienne Lawrence. Thank you so much for joining us. As we know, things are popping off down there, little south of the equator? Yeah, in terms of Brazil. And fortunately, I have Calvin Dark, who's the Democratic strategist and global affairs commentator, also analyst, and also a principal and co-founder of RC Communications. Thanks for joining us, Calvin.
Good to be here.
All right, so we know thousands of supporters of Brazil's former president, Jair Bolsonaro, broke into the country's congressional building last week and the Supreme Court presidential palace. A lot of those individuals were arrested, and there's so many questions right now with how things are going to proceed in the country, given that it seems to be very divided in terms of people who are ready to move on from Bolsonaro and those who are not. So can you give us an update?
Yes, especially happening right near the 2-year anniversary of January 6th in the United States. Americans, as we watch this, is kind of like, PTSD, seeing this happen, a lot of the same strategies, same goals were used by the Brazilian protesters that we saw in our own capital on January the 6th. I think what's important now is, as things have calmed down a bit, people are rightfully trying to figure out who's responsible. And that goes from the people who actually protested to potentially former President Bolsonaro, who has been in Orlando since he left office. So a lot remains to be seen. A lot of people in the US, including several members of Congress, are asking that his visa not be renewed. That, like I said, depends on what happens with the Brazilian Supreme Court, as they are now allowed the federal prosecutors to investigate Bolsonaro to see if he could be charged potentially with inciting or fomenting what we saw there.
Indeed, as we learned at the close of last week, that the Brazilian Supreme Court, as you've noted, now they're approving including that ex-President Bolsonaro in this incitement probe in terms of the January 8th riot in Brasilia. And I know that, as you noted, gives a lot of people here in the United States, this PTSD in terms of January 6th, and then having Bolsonaro here in Florida, it almost seems like, are we being a safe haven toward individuals who are trying to stage a coup to overturn their government? What is the response here in terms of the Biden administration?
Well, I think the Biden administration, they kind of have their hands tied, at least now, because regardless of what people think Bolsonaro's culpability with what happened, there's precedent for allowing former heads of state. He was actually a current head of state when he got to Florida. He skipped out on the inauguration, so I think he had a day or two left in his term. They got to be very careful because we don't want that same thing to happen to current and former presidents of the United States when they're traveling. If there isn't an extradition order, or where he hasn't been charged with the crime. So I'm sure that the Biden administration, is considering that, but their hands are kind of tied. I do want to give credit to the Biden administration for doing what I think was the most important thing after this happened, and that was quickly and unambiguously denouncing it. That went a long way because these kind of things get fomented in ambiguity when people are saying, well, are they protesting because they don't like Lula da Silva, or they weren't sure if the election was fraudulent or not? You don't do that in a democracy here or in Brazil. And Joe Biden's statement right after it happened really was effective at conveying that.
Absolutely. I remember when Da Silva took the win, that Biden, also Trudeau in Canada, and a number of other foreign leaders made sure that they recognized and honored in terms of making phone calls and making sure it was very publicly voiced, because there seems to be on an international level this push for fascist regimes. And a number of them have seemed to come through in terms of being elected. And then there are others who are staging coups, whether it is a particular leader or even just kind of sectors of their governments. But I also want to bring up the fact that what I think they call Bolsonaro the Trump of the tropics, this kind of alignment between the similarity between both Trump and Bolsonaro. What are people seeing there in terms of kind of just maybe the fraction between the two men?
Well, when all of this happened and I found out that Bolsonaro was in Florida, I thought maybe he was going to be working on the 2024 campaign for former President Donald Trump, because they are two peas in a pod. Now, granted, they have different backgrounds. Bolsonaro had a lot more government, military experience before he became president, but a lot of the same policies or ways of expressing those policies were similar between Bolsonaro and Trump. What's definitely clear is this election denial, even down to blaming a bug in the voting machines in Brazil. And one of the things I've just been really thinking a lot about since this happened was, former President Donald Trump did not invent coups. He did not invent attempts to overturn democracy. However, what he did do, the attempts at doing that, he gave the biggest platform for democracy there is, the United States, for what happened on January the 6th. And it's very clear that people were watching, and that some people took that as a license to, try the home game. And I think that is one of the things that the United States has to realize. What we do, the world is watching. And I think that it's clear to see that a lot of the strategies and objectives and just what unfolded was patterned after January the 6th here in our country.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more in terms of seeing these copycats going on internationally, whether it's the group that tried to stage a coup in Germany, or a number of the other countries going on right now, and also the uplifting and uprising in this fascist movement. It's very scary and disconcerting. And I also know that it's kind of a question of Bolsonaro in terms of his longevity, especially given that he didn't seem to challenge De Silva's win as expeditiously as he could have. Do you think that that's signaling to us that he may be in a position where he's ready to move on?
Well, it could be he's ready to move on, or it could be that he's planning a future political move. I will say that one of the things that was markedly different, and I wondered this when I saw the protest, is if we look at what happened on January the 6th, former President Trump was still President Trump. These protests happened after Lula da Silva had been sworn in. So, I kind of wonder what the objective was. Although one of the Bolsonaro former officials that the Supreme Court also included in their order, I think they searched his home and they found a draft decree to cancel some of the millions of the votes that would have basically reminded me of Georgia. They had, we need this many votes discounted so that we can win. And I think it's very serious. And if Bolsonaro had any hands in that, and is planning a political comeback, it could be very dangerous for a huge economic partner with the US and a huge player in the Western Hemisphere.
I find it to be very entertaining with the thought that Bolsonaro's people were documenting and writing down how they would stage a coup. I can just picture them with like their little trapper keepers and their little pens and writing down, we're gonna do this and then this. It just almost seems very foolish. But in terms of actually punishing them, I would like to hope that Brazil has a better track record of holding officials accountable than the US does. What are your thoughts?
Well, one of the things, it remains to be seen exactly how justice will be handled in this situation. But as I was looking at some of the statements, reading some of the orders from the judiciary in Brazil, it seems that they give a lot more weight to inciting. For example, with Bolsonaro, one of the things that he had done that people wanted to charge him with or say that he was part of the protesters was a video that he posted about how the election was stolen and how Lula da Silva was actually elected or put in power by the Supreme Court. Now he didn't post that until 2 days after. So it's kind of hard to say that inspired people. But what I've seen from the Brazilian authorities is they're saying that was a continuation of this incitement of anti-democracy. And that's some of the same things that we kind of dealt with. So it remains to be seen if they'll follow through with that. But I think it is good that their kind of bar for supporting democracy is a lot higher than ours is sometimes.
Yeah, that indeed seems to be the case. And I really hope that is the case. And I know we just have a few minutes left, but since we're talking Brazil and we're also talking about infirmities and shortcomings of our democracy, let's talk about George Santos. I know he is facing kind of simple fraud charges down there in Brazil. And I know it's very unlikely that he would be extradited unless Brazil got very aggressive in seeking that extradition. But what are your thoughts as someone who has that expertise there?
Well, I think it's interesting that we, two of the biggest stories of politicians living in the United States have to do with, can we or should we get them back to Brazil? I think that what's happening with George Santos, it's now become kind of like the Anna Delvey situation of 2023. I'm really looking to see what the Republicans are going to do, because like I said, this is unprecedented, but it has so many aspects. You have the international, what's going on with Brazil, also what he did here. I'm sitting back and watching. I just hate that the constituents who voted for him have to have him as a representative until we figure all of this out.
Absolutely, but I sure hope that the parameters and things that go into place in terms of vetting people gets a lot stronger and people learn from this situation so we don't have to repeat it. But I know there's also people out there who would love to follow you on social media and also to learn more from your insight. And can you please tell us where they can go?
On Twitter, I'm Tails Darkside, or all the rest of my social media links are at calvindark.com.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time. That is Calvin Dark, Democratic strategist.